Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It is really great to have you all today here for the data.europa Academy webinar on open data as a public good, evidence-based development across territories. I'll just give everyone a brief moment to join in. In the meantime, please feel free to say hello in the chats. Let us know where you're connecting from today. We're in Central Europe and it's very rainy here, so I would love to know where you're connecting from, and hopefully some of you are experiencing some sunshine. From Greece, from Austria. That sounds already a lot sunnier than where we are. But great to see so many of you here. I would like to start. Yeah, so my name is Carlijn de Smets, and I work at the Publications Office of the data.europa Academy, which is our learning hub for open data, data policy, and data reuse all across Europe. The Open Data Day is an annual celebration to spotlight the importance of open data. This day helps in fostering community-driven knowledge sharing, and the event is supported by the Open Knowledge Foundation, who will provide more insights in today's presentation. In today's webinar, we will honor this year's Open Data Day and highlight the value of open data to support governance decisions related to territorial accessibility and service provision. A central focus of today's webinar will also be on understanding how open data can inform evidence-based decision-making through access to territorial data and social gradient use cases. Data coming from a rural context is often less available and less visible, whilst it's super crucial for data-driven policymaking. By drawing examples today from the UK and Ireland, this webinar will demonstrate how open data can inform policymaking in places that may receive less attention. But before we begin, I would just like to take you through a few practical notes. So this session is being recorded. And the recording and the presentation slides will be made available on the data.europa Academy and shared with you after the event. We also like to tell you that at the end of the event, we will invite you to complete a short feedback survey. A link and a QR code will also appear on the screen at the end. We would really love to appreciate your feedback and see how we can improve these sessions in the future. And you're also welcome to post any questions in the chat at any time. We collect them throughout the webinar, and then at the end, we will use them within our Q&A session. Now I'm very pleased to welcome today's speakers, and we have quite a nice lineup. First, we will have Solana Larsen. Solana works with the Open Knowledge Foundation, leading a new AI literacy initiative for social sector organizations. For 2 decades, Open Knowledge has been a leading source and voice on how to share open data in the public interest. They develop open source technical tools and collaborate with globally distributed networks to encourage open knowledge sharing. Solana has worked with a variety of open interest for organizations and communities, including Global Voices, where she was the managing editor, and with the Mozilla Foundation, where she was an editor of an annual Internet Health Report. Solana will start this webinar today by introducing a bit about the Open Knowledge Foundation and the Open Data Day initiative. Then we will welcome Johanna Walker. Johanna specializes in data-driven innovation, public and private sector co-creation, data ecosystems, data governance and ethics, generative AI and data literacy. So she's an expert in all fields. She's currently exploring the use of LLMs to improve public sector open data discovery and for digital infrastructure assessments. In today's session, Johanna will present how the prioritization of urban data impacts the collection, availability, and use of data in rural contexts. Last but not least, we will have Patrick Collins with us. Patrick is a principal data scientist at Pobal, with deep expertise in advanced analytics, resource allocation modeling, and geospatial problem solving. By ensuring transparency and reproducibility throughout his analytical work, he leverages multivariate analysis, machine learning, and spatial decision support to help the government direct hundreds of millions of euros in targeted investment towards the communities that need it most. Patrick will conclude the presentation today with an introduction to the Irish social gradient tool called Pobal, and will also explain how it leverages open data to identify geography-based health inequalities. To guide you again through the session, I would like to show you the indicative agenda. So yeah, we're currently introducing the speakers. Shortly, Solana will start to present the Open Knowledge Foundation, the principles, and open data reuse. Then we will move to Johanna, who will talk about publishing rural open data within the EU. And then finally, we will have Patrick elaborate on using open data to support socioeconomic analysis. And then in the end, we will have a Q&A session and the closing remarks. And with that, I think I've spoken enough. I would love to give the word to Solana and get started with the content. So Solana, go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to be here and also proud to represent the Open Knowledge Foundation, which we just heard is a 20-year-old organization. It has chapters in more than 40 different countries, people around the world who are working together to figure out how to use open data in the best way possible, with the purpose of making knowledge accessible to everyone in the world. Open Data Day is a project of the Open Knowledge Foundation. It's sort of it's not really a day in this case, it's several days. Since I made this slide, more events have been added, but there are about 120 events taking place over this time period in many, many different languages, held by chapters, held by affiliated organizations. But it's really about having a conversation or practical exchanges of how do we do this better worldwide? How can we learn from each other? How can we keep iterating on what it even means for data to be open? And I think this is part of what I wanted just to talk to you a bit about is I think those of us who have worked on open for a long time forget sometimes how this term was created by individuals together, you know, that these terms are something that we decide together through social processes, through processes of actually building together and generating new ideas together. In 2005, the Open Knowledge Foundation wrote down the definition of what it means for something to be open. And this definition, which became a standard for open database licensing worldwide, is something that is still maintained by an advisory council. It's really something that a lot of people put work into figuring out. How do you do open? How should it be shared in order to have that designation? And I think part of that is, you know, how do we make it more accessible for people to use? How do we develop open software, different ways and methods for people to investigate the data, to produce that data in the first place, to govern that data, take ownership of the data? There are all these different elements around openness, more than just, you know, spreadsheets on the internet. And this is part of what I find really exciting about the conversation that's happening today. Over the past 20 years, I think there was a sort of a time period in the middle or not so long ago where we maybe got a little bit complacent, or felt like, okay, now we know what it means for things to be open. And part of the conversation that the Open Knowledge Foundation is really instigating today is how do we redefine open in ways that are more in tune with all that we've learned about both the benefits and the risks of having this data be open. How do we learn from the conversations that there have been around digital colonialism, data extractivism, racial and gender injustice, different inequalities that exist through interpretations of data or use of data by corporate actors or governments that maybe don't have the public interest at heart, or maybe have a misunderstanding of how to accomplish that. How do we make sure that the deal that we've made with open data keeps serving people's best interests? And part of how we figure this out, or how we keep reiterating how we do this better, I think, is about working together in community. So it's about talking to people about it. It's about opening up these conversations beyond the technical communities that are maybe experts in how to manage or maintain this data, but how do we create collaborations between technical communities and social sector organizations or governments or local communities who might be the subjects of data, but maybe should be the owners of data? How do we figure out how to do things differently and appropriately for each of the individual use cases? And how can we, whether we work for governments or civil society, how can we share best practices that can be replicated by others, set good examples of best practices that can advance the field in general? And I put just a couple of screenshots of different publications that we've worked on at Open Knowledge recently in the past year or so, where we look at how do we build technology together? Like, how do you actually involve a community, a broad community of users in the development of a software tool? How do you, when you have open source technology, keep maintaining and governing that technology together with a community that doesn't only involve the developers of it, but also the users of it and the beneficiaries, the intended beneficiaries of it. We also have resources and tools to make working with data easier. We have something called the School of Data, where there are different resources and courses that you can take to learn how to do specific things. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to leave you with, that this is a conversation that needs to keep going, that it's important that we talk to one another across borders, that we encourage use of data beyond our own communities, and that we look for fellowship and collaboration with others, and that we listen when people say that the use of data isn't working for them, that we think about how can we do this differently, and how can we use data to address power imbalances and injustice, and continue to iterate on what it means for something to be open, so that things aren't just like open for openness sake, but that we really keep the best interests of people in mind throughout all our work. So I'm excited to hear the next speakers, and yeah, looking forward to this conversation just here today. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Solana, for this great introduction on the topic. Now I would like to welcome Johanna, so if she can turn on her camera and microphone. Perfect. Then we can continue on to the next speaker.
Yes, hello. Well, while my camera is turning on, I just want to say I personally appreciate the creation of the open definition by Open Knowledge Foundation, because my PhD thesis was actually on open data for open innovation. So understanding what openness meant was so vital for that. So, thank you. And thank you for the ongoing work, super important to our community. Okay, so I'm just going to try to move to my slides now. Can everyone hear me? See if I can see a thumbs up anywhere. Yes, perfect. That's good news. So I'm going to talk today about are EU members publishing sufficient rural open data? And I've kind of titled this, A Village is Not a Small City. Because when we started looking at this, we came to it because we'd done a lot of work around smart cities. And this became, certainly in kind of the mid-teens, such a massive driver of both opening data and all the activities around opening data. So all those nice open innovation activities. So there's a lot of efforts, drives for SMEs, public-private sector co-creation with open data, creating hackathons so that people, researchers, SMEs would come together, create new products. And of course, these were all held in cities, or not all of them, but the majority were held in cities because cities had the infrastructure to do this. They had the population to do this. They had quite often the money to do this, the drive to do it, the institutions to do it. So as a result, a lot of initiatives were based on not only data from cities, but also that brought a huge amount of positionality with it. So there were a lot of assumptions baked into a lot of those solutions and a lot of those issues that were addressed, a lot of the ways we worked with open data, a lot of things we thought about the most important open data to open was this positionality, this unconscious bias, if you like, about a city. So much so, I think that in one project we looked at based in rural Scotland, in the north of the UK, they said, well, a village is just a small city. And so I've put this really quite ridiculous image in here so we can really question, is a village in any way a small city? Does that indeed help us to think like that or not? And I'm going to put it to you, it very much doesn't. And it's been actually quite a problem for the opening of data and also the creating of solutions for citizens with open data, which for me is a really big driver of why we open data at all. So let's talk about some of those assumptions and biases that might actually be problematic. And so here we have 4 really key areas that we frequently open data for. And so our first, we have a bus transport. Now, transport in a city, quite often the solutions, one of the biggest success stories, and it continues to be really driven by open data, is the UK, is London's Transport for London. They did a really fabulous thing very early on where they created a really great platform for opening their data and then just saying to people, come and create solutions based on this, and some really good things came out of this, such as, for instance, lots of apps about when you could see when your next bus was coming instead of just waiting for them to turn up. And then, you know, you'd see, well, nothing's coming for 9 minutes and then there'll be 4 coming within the space of 3 minutes. And that kind of app is just actually not remotely relevant if you live, as I do, in a rural area where you know that the buses come once an hour, and in fact we have one bus that comes twice a week. And so you're not only the solutions you want to build different, but also the problems you're addressing are different. You just aren't moving such large populations so frequently, but you are moving, and so continuously for 24 hours a day, but you are moving them potentially on demand. And there are actually a number of places, small towns, villages, especially tourist ones in Devon and Cornwall, which are very rural parts of the UK, that have on-demand bus services. Then we've got this robot here, and what he, or possibly she, I'm not sure, is indicating is kind of demands around communications and technologies. So for instance, solutions we're building that will work very, very well in, for instance, London, Paris, Barcelona, Helsinki, wherever you are not necessarily going to work so well in somewhere. I'm going to go back to rural Cornwall again, where they are primarily made of granite And this gives them real problems with the way we run mobile in this country. So again, a solution that's going to work, something you may want to provide based on open data that will work in, let's say, Liverpool or Manchester in the UK, is not going to necessarily work. In Cornwall, you need a different solution. Again, we have a hospital picture here. This represents health and well-being. Now, one of the biggest challenges in cities for health is queuing. How long do you have to wait to see a doctor? You're probably very close in location to a doctor or a hospital, but actually getting in there is usually the challenge. Whereas, of course, rurally, the problem is generally that you have a really long distance to get to, especially to tertiary healthcare, which is, you know, a hospital that would have operating facilities like this. And lastly, we have housing. So there were assumptions made about housing that we based on in the and flats and the density of housing, that if we drive that with our knowledge about how people live in cities, it's going to be vastly inapplicable to people in the countryside. And we also make some kind of demographic assumptions. For instance, most people in the UK who have a house in a city are very comparatively well off. Whereas just because you have a house in the countryside does not necessarily indicate the same income level. It simply indicates that we have different housing stock. And if you take the variety of this, and I'll come back to, the variation isn't even consistent across Europe. So for instance, European rural populations really vary when we think, are rural areas rich or poor? So just over a quarter of EU citizens live in rural areas, and the more densely populated EU member states, this is not going to be a massive shock to anyone, have a higher proportion of urban population. But the opposite is true for very many countries in Eastern Europe, particularly. Over 40% of Lithuanian, Slovenian, Slovakian populations live in rural areas, which are designated by Eurostat as such. But however, even in Western member states, such as Ireland, which we're going to hear about, France and Austria, over a third of the population are classified as living rurally. Although in Western and Northern member cases, rural living offers comparatively better housing and relatively available employment, in Eastern, Southern and Baltic member states, rural citizens tend to be amongst the poorest. So it absolutely varies even amongst the rural context. So I've just got a little image here of the rural poverty risk in 2022. Thank you very much to data.europa.eu, from whom I borrowed this. And you can see that there is an absolute variation between the share of people who are at risk of poverty or social exclusion in both cities, suburbs, and rural areas. Whereas you can see that in Romania, there's a very high risk of poverty or social inclusion in a rural area, whereas we have down here in Malta a much higher suburban level comparatively. So that's thinking about rural population data and the people who are living in those areas and what they need, and taking into account that we can't even look at rural areas as a homogenous deal. We also then have to think about rural economic activities. They fundamentally, we are not growing pine forests in our cities. We are not largely having vast agriculture for food supply in our cities. We are largely not fishing in our cities. So all these activities, again, become as vitally important for urban areas. But again, they are based in rural areas. And if we are not producing sufficient data about rural areas, about populations, we are going to absolutely both fail to provide the appropriate solutions for those citizens, but also fail to understand what the bigger economic picture, taking into account these activities. So we therefore set out to understand, given how much of given the link we hope that we've been working on for years between the data that gets used and the data that gets published, and that we try and publish for use, hence the emphasis on the high value data sets. Are we publishing sufficient rural data to address these issues, to change that positionality, to understand that we need to have often very different solutions for rural challenges? So our first hypothesis for this was that countries with more rural populations would be publishing more rural data. So let me just take you through this hypothesis. So what we did here was we explored the open data sets from data.europa.eu to understand the overall availability of rural open data. And again, we said we included economic data, so we looked at agriculture, fishing, forestry, and what we could find to be tagged as rural tourism. And then we looked at rural population data, i.e. we looked at population data from countries with a large rural population as defined by Eurostat. So we found that Germany, France, Italy and Spain presented the highest total and urban populations. France has the largest rural population overall. In addition, in 2022, we ran all our experiments both in 2019 and 2022, so if we could see there was a change. In addition, in 2022, 11 out of 29 countries possessed higher rural than urban populations. So as a percentage of total populations, Netherlands, Spain and Iceland have the greatest rural populations, which remain consistent between 2018 and 2022. So countries with large populations, such as Spain, Germany, Italy and France, are leaders in publishing data sets. And they also have high rural populations. We can therefore hypothesize that they will publish a lot of rural data sets. So we did find a correlation between the total number of data sets and the total population. In contrast, we didn't find a correlation with the total number of data sets and the size of the rural population. So this suggests that while there is a relationship between the total and urban population in a country and the higher number of published data sets, the rural population didn't influence the published data sets. So that was quite an interesting understanding and kind of bore out our idea that the more urban, that there is this link between cities and urban populations and the publication of open data. So using the same correlation test, we found the number of total data sets has a weak correlation with the number of rural data sets. So that this indicates that a country that publishes many data sets overall may not necessarily publish a high number of rural data sets. So this leads us to think that there's a comparatively insufficient number of rural data sets if we look at it purely statistically. So going on to our next hypothesis, it's a little caterpillar. You'd be surprised how hard it is to find a picture of a caterpillar that's not poisonous. It's not what I want to suggest here. So our hypothesis too is that EU member states with more rural populations are in earlier stages of open data maturity. That hypothesis came around. We said, well, you know, if they're just earlier in their journey, that would make sense in terms of publishing. And so therefore, well, maybe what we need to do is support them to develop their journey, and then they will publish more data about rural populations and rural economic activities. So what we did on here, obviously we went to data.europa.eu and we looked at, I mean, as I'm sure you all know, that the maturity of the open data on the Open Data Maturity Index run by data.europa.eu, which 2025 just came out a couple of weeks ago, I think. It's calculated using valuation of the quality, impact, portal and policy of national data sets. So we hypothesized that because rural data could be more challenging to collect in more rural EU member states or EU member states with less urban populations, that therefore they would be in lower stages of open data maturity. We actually found out that where we measure the rurality of an EU country by where their population resides, there is a very weak correlation with its open data maturity score. A higher percentage of both rural and urban population correlated with a higher ODM. So as the effect is tiny and it occurs for both population groups, this didn't really help us provide any further insight. So we investigated the correlation between the ODM of a country, the open data maturity, and the total number of total and rural open data sets published. We find a weak correlation between the open data maturity and the total and rural number of data sets. So our only problem with this was that, in fact, this weak correlation could be a function of how the ODM is calculated. However, the similarity for both total data sets and the rural data sets suggest that whatever the cause, rural data sets are not necessarily related to lower open data maturity. So therefore, there could have been some kind of intervention created here, but we don't think that is the necessity. We don't think it's about helping these countries develop in their journey. That's not what's needed to progress here. So our last hypothesis was that countries with a higher percentage of their GDP derived from agriculture will publish more agricultural open data sets. I think that seems reasonable. So our third finding here was the lack of the relationship between the importance of agriculture in a country's GDP and the number of open data sets published in the category of agriculture on the data.europa.eu website. Again, that covers fisheries, forestry, and food. So agriculture covers 47% of the EU territory and represents around 40% of the EU budget. It's a really interesting piece on data.europa.eu, which I recommend that you have a look at if you're interested in this, about the common agricultural policy in data. It was the earliest policy of the EU. So agriculture is 47% and it's 40% of the EU budget. Forestry accounts for another 1% of total EU GDP, and it's also very important culturally. And fishery is a key investment area for developing sustainability and growth across the EU. So agriculture is the largest category on the EDP, but highly concentrated. These stats are from 2023, but I don't think it's changed very much. Germany, Poland, and France provided over 94% of the open agricultural data sets in 2020, which I think is wild. This has changed over the years, with a number of countries, including Czechia, publishing substantial numbers of agricultural data sets. But Germany, Poland, and France continue to publish the most, not an amount that's in line with how much agriculture they are, or their rural population, or even the size of the country, just an outstandingly large amount. So if we use the percentage of agricultural GDP in 2018 as a proxy for the importance of the rural economy sector and correlate this with the total number or proportion of agricultural data sets published, then the results remain negative. There's just no significant correlation between a country's economic reliance on agriculture and the total number of agricultural data sets, or the proportion of agriculture in the overall published data sets, with either the data set count from either the ones we looked at in 2019 or 2020. So for instance, taking France, their agricultural sector was 1.91% of GDP in 2022, and it published tens of thousands of agricultural data sets. Slovakia's agricultural contribution in GDP was similar at 2.22, but it published tens of data sets, like literally tens of agricultural data sets. And the statistical analysis shows that France and Slovakia are not outliers from the pattern. So when we ran this, as I mentioned, we did our research once in 2019, 2020, and then again in 2022, 23. For this one, we didn't, because all the trends indicated that there would be no discernible change. So this is a really interesting area, because we didn't go into what the interventions would be specifically for agriculture. We came up with a whole range of policy recommendations for how to move past this smart urban bias and lose some of that positionality and be more open to what we need to do to publish open data and to use open data. We didn't specifically look at an intervention for this, but it's really interesting finding, I think. So it's a little bit of a breakneck rush through there, but I do want to indicate this. It's not all open data projects. There has recently been a greater focus on rural data. So the Rural Observatory supports the knowledge production and aims at improving data collection dissemination related to EU rural areas. That's really important. The EU project Granular has done some really interesting work. They screen data sets relevant to rural diversity, and they have started developing 90 novel indicators for rural areas. And it's exactly this kind of focus on how to measure, are we producing the right data for rural areas, and are we making it available? It's these kinds of indicators that are really going to help us get that rural data out there. And I do encourage you to go and read, if you haven't, the rest of our paper, Smart Rural, the Open Data Gap, because there are a lot of instances of why, use cases, examples of why rural data matters for rural populations and for the rural economy. But we're going to hear from Patrick next, a really fantastic example from Ireland. So thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have some questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Johanna. Super interesting topic and really nice insights, and a great time to hand over indeed to Patrick. So I would like to give the floor now to Patrick to share his insights from Ireland.
Thank you very much, and quite interesting, Johanna, seeing that aspect of the rural and how important, yes, it is, and it is something we definitely take into consideration here in Ireland. And I was happy to see in terms of the proportion of our rural data, it is up in the upper end of that spectrum, so glad to see that. Now, I'm just going to talk to you here about the deprivation index. So this is a social gradient tool developed with open data to actually allocate funds to areas that are in need. But just before that, I just want to kind of give a introduction of who we are. So Pobal are a semi-state body which supports government programs based upon education, some childcare, social inclusion projects, and in terms of actually identifying those in need within these communities to actually allocate, as you can see, 1.3 billion over the last year. The organization itself has over 800 employees. We're spread all throughout the country. And we're actually over 40 programs currently. So as we're continuing to grow. Now, I just want to look at, through the presentation, goes like how we're getting the data, what we're doing to actually create this data into a model, and then actually continuing that open data aspect of actually sharing and then enhancing that and analyzing to show how it is actually then used. Just as a warning, then this is a bit over a technical talk, so sorry if it's a bit overhead, but I will try to keep it available for everyone. So where's our data? So in the Irish ecosystem, we have our open data portal, and of which you can see some of our data sets we share through here. Vast amounts of data on that through in the environment, legal, science, technology, and so forth. And there's a lot of participation with many government organizations and some non-government. And as you can see, like 21,000 data sets across the country. So just as a slight aside here, what's important to note is kind of the geographical units that we use within the country. Now, we do have our nuts and the standard European reporting, but like we go finer and finer within this. The standard local authority, like your counties and such, yeah, that's grand. That's kind of report at that level. Local electoral area is also something that is interest of the political side, to which they want to know what's their constituency looking like. The electoral division is quite well maintained because this is a legally mandated and legally governed units. However, we go in even finer again. Small area, of which there are 18,000 across the country. And within each small area, there's like 80 to 120 dwellings. So that could be about from 80 to about 300 people thereabouts. And what's also nice in terms of actually when you look at the maps, you can see like where kind of urban and rural areas kind of exist. So it's like, okay, when you see data plot on this, you can get a good sense. But like, I think I'm probably quite happy that this exists, because we can actually drill down right to the kind of these certain units and be sure like that we're targeting quite specific areas, especially with the population density, or sorry, the population numbers being low in each one of these. Within the open data ecosystem, the main thing we'll use at this level would be the census data, the small area population statistics, of which there are 800 variables within a data set among all of the 19,000 small areas. And they go across vast ranges of like commuting, housing, occupation, and your standard demographics then as well. And this is basically core for even a lot of other analysis, even outside of deprivation. And that then tied in with the open data ecosystem on the GIS side, your geographical information systems, to which we can then actually do the mapping. So again, this is another thing that's quite maintained, because at the end of the day, like a lot of open data, kind of high value data sets are all around the geography. And if the geography elements aren't maintained quite well, you can't actually get any good information across and understanding the kind of what's on the ground. So the deprivation index itself, its core element is this quotation saying that deprivation is an absence of essential or desirable attributes, possessions, or opportunities which are considered no more than minimum by society. So it's basically saying what are the expectations for everyone to actually exist? You want the opportunities, you want the possessions, so kind of housing, transport, even food, and like even clothing and so forth. And these are desirable attributes, and those who cannot get these would be considered deprived. Now, this actually then would be drawn down into a kind of more of a conceptual model. So we would break this down into certain elements. And this is where we definitely consider the rural to the urban elements. So whereby on the rural side, we're looking at more so demographic decline, looking at kind of population loss and the effects of migration, such that these are the areas that have a lot of rural decline that tend to be kind of more deprived. And that's what the concept you would see. Then obviously you're in the more the equal urban and rural side, you can like also the element of kind of job types, education, and so forth. And then as you get more towards kind of larger, predominantly urban areas, we look at kind of unemployment, lone parents, and kind of low skill bases. And like of these areas, we like, this is your conception model. And you then think, okay, how can I use this for actually the data that we have to actually create this model? And here is what this model looks like. Now, this is a latent variable model. It's a structural cohesion model to which you can then correlate these measured variables in these squares. So we can extract from that open data your age dependency rate, education, lone parents, persons per room. And we link through these through the conceptual model. And this is kind of well designed and well maintained. I think I was thinking earlier, like this is nearly 20 years old, and oh my God, it's been consistent, and we actually can do longitudinal analysis, not just on the particular wave that comes out. So as I say, like this is commissioned by Pobal every 5 years, so we have that level of independence in terms of how it's created, and the 5 years again is from the census wave. I think that the last one's delayed by an extra year due to something happened in 2020. I can't remember which. Oh yeah, that thing. And it is with this that then we actually get our data. What does the data look like? So more statistics. So a standard, close to a standard normal deviation, of which we then break it down to certain bands. So this is actually looking at every of these 18,000 small areas. What is the number that comes out, and we can see it follows this distribution. Here we have our mostly disadvantaged side, and this is our mostly affluent side. So, and we just break these into band of 10. So of which, like if we just relate this to the actual normal distribution curve, we'll be focused on this probably 15%. So this is from, in this case, it was the minus 10 to minus and below, as you saw there earlier, was actually, you can see on the scale, minus 10 to minus 30. And these are the areas we want to target. These of what we identified, that's where we will be going. And what does that look like? Now, obviously, this isn't how we share it, but like you can actually already see a lot of kind of West Coast, kind of rural areas, a bit more disadvantaged, and we can see pockets of them even throughout. And even in urban areas, we can spot that disadvantage, like these red areas, kind of northwest, northwest Dublin and southeast. You can see the divide. That's a general overview. But one way we then continue to share is using our Pobal Maps tool. So that's maps.pobal.ie. And you can go in and you can scroll right down and look at this granular level, to which we can again look in a extreme urban area, Dublin. We can see this again, this divide, and we can see where these pockets of extreme disadvantage are. And we goes, okay, this is good. And what's quite important about this is when we constructed the index is actually having the sense of what's on the ground. So you can actually visit these locations and it goes, yeah, this is a private area. And you can see that there is those evidence of those areas that you know that are kind of rich or kind of poor, and you're like, yeah, this index is telling us. Because like, if you don't have any trust in the model and between what you see in the data and what's on the ground, how you to know for the rest of the country, because you're not going to know every area in the country. And then we can look at then rural areas, and we can see some pockets of disadvantage around here, even this small town Ballina out the west, and you can see these again. The small area size kind of definitely indicates these rural areas. And there's some pockets of affluence here as well in rural areas. So also another part of this tool, if you go on Explore, you can actually click on the area and see all the elements of this. So again, this is disadvantaged, and it's probably due to a high age dependency ratio on male unemployment. So you can kind of get a sense, because like, why is it disadvantaged based upon the parameters we saw. Again, sharing the data, then this goes back up. We've taken our census open data and then remodeled it, and then we've released this. So this is going to be at the ED level. So that's the next level up. So we have to take into account data privacy, because you can drill down at the small area level. So we have to kind of raise up to the next level, which is still a usable, and it's still a national level to which people can consume. So after all of that, we've got this index, and it goes, grand, now what do you do with it? So one initial thing is to do, like just as we're looking there, exploring data just visually, we then actually look at with other data sets. So this was the spatial correlation with disability. And we're looking at this, and it was like, okay, this is interesting. It's one of the first parts of exploratory analysis. So like, we're seeing this pattern, and it goes, these areas that are quite kind of have a high population of high potential disability. We see, okay, it's matching here, and goes, okay, that's interesting. And then also move on to a more rural area and goes, okay, we're seeing the same disadvantaged part, and then this kind of more higher proportion of disability. I was like, okay, this is interesting. But that leaves us then, okay, let's do statistical analysis, and then we can see one of which, this is again from the census, and it's totally independent variable, to which of reported health. So in the sense they score themselves from on a scale of pretty much 0 to 5, and we can then just infer that into this type of value. And so you can see, oh look, those at disadvantage have a lower kind of average health score than those affluent. I was like, okay, that's what we saw in the maps, and we're seeing that then through the data. And it's like, okay, this is interesting, and we can actually then use that and pass on that information to the Department of Health, and they be interested in goes, okay, this deprivation tool is quite helpful for us to actually identify areas that will be of greater need from a health perspective. And actually with that, we can also, again, just bring it back to the disability, and they can keep drilling down whichever kind of data they provide. And this was one then on the correlation with bringing in the age cohorts then as well. So we can see in the general consensus, like as we get older, there's more experience of disability, more higher proportions. However, within each age cohort, you can see this the disadvantaged end tends to experience higher rates of disability than the more affluent areas. And one of these that came through is like looking at this younger population of 0 to 14, they experienced this strong rate of disability. However, that is not seen in an affluent end until kind of late middle age, and even to more senior ages. I was like, oh my God, like this is really kind of identified that these needs for these areas need to be going there. And again, this is independent of, because the model treats urban and rural equally. Basically, you can look at the map and say, look, these areas would be of a priority. Now, it's great to, again, keep on using the deprivation and looking at the geographic side. Certain things we want to identify communities. So not just particular areas, but actually entire communities, and say like, okay, we can use certain techniques and just bring all these to identify these communities. And I think this one, like I'm from Dublin myself, so I wouldn't have known Cork. So I presented this to someone from Cork, and he goes, yeah, that's right. These are the communities that would be disadvantaged. And it's great for any community organizations within these areas actually to support them. So it's not just supporting the people themselves, but supporting the organizations that support the people. And that's kind of helpful to know, again, which communities to support. One of the bigger challenges is when you're supporting these organizations, they themselves may be located in an affluent area, but they're actually supporting a more disadvantaged area. And it's because you got this kind of human-drawn areas for geographic units for these areas, and as you'd expect. So how do you actually solve this? And this was one thing we looked at in terms of, okay, let's make this bespoke radial model, whereby we take where you are, we draw these boundaries and we can find the actual average kind of deprivation. And actually what's interesting is that these areas on this side are actually kind of low population. I think this is more industrial estate. And it is these larger populations are actually would be represented within this large sphere. So we can actually solve this. I think this was like a +20 for a score for this organization, but when we recalculated using this, it was actually more of a -10. It was like, yes, look, it's understandable that this organization, Youth Services, is supporting this disadvantaged part of the community. And that was one of the things we definitely wanted to be sure in terms of any of the where the weaknesses of the index may happen because of these geography elements. So one of the, just a slide here, just on the resource allocation. So it's good to actually get all these numbers and to extract all this information, but like, how do you calculate the funding? How do you actually work out the amount of support that is needed to be brought across? And this is the Just Transition Fund, and I was looking at various aspects of the program. And the program is designed in a particular way, and they'll include certain elements. So this was like your employment, the environmental aspect, and this was a bog area because it was peatland area that had been recently ceased from utilizing for energy, to which the communities were then affected on the employment side. So you can see one particular area here had 48%, 49% unemployment. So, yeah, and it's then recognizing this area needs support. However, it is not taking account of those who are also disadvantaged areas, as well as suffering from these unemployment and these environmental sensitivities. And what we do is just we look at these areas, look at the proportions within these areas of those disadvantaged, and then scale them. So you can see here, this top one here is like, it is not as deprived as these down here. And it's like, it is using this index going to help support those who later on may need this. Now, one element is that this you'd use a standard, you add equal weights to each of these. And it's actually to make the argument then, okay, the deprivation may need heavier weights, to which we then support that. And there's a kind of fine tuning and such. But like, one thing as I didn't previously mention is like how unbiased and fair this then becomes. So it's not just looking at an area and just like putting your hand in the air and it goes, yeah, look, this one needs support because I have a louder speaking politician who speaks up for this area. It's like, no, we have the data to say like this other area needs more support. And it's data that then helps us to actually make sure everyone gets heard, and of those who are not well represented actually get represented in the data, especially on the rural side of things. So just before, I don't want to kind of start closing out here, just moving towards the loop, or those kind of, it's kind of a data science loop, more the open data loop I call it here. Take our open data and go through the various aspects, various models. These can be kind of linear models, they can be just standard proportions. Add that onto the geography. And like I say, like having the maps is one thing, bringing on the analysis and looking at the analytics in terms of what correlations are we seeing. Can we actually show a certain department, maybe another one for education, another one for transport, and goes, here, look, we saw your transport data. We see this with deprivation. There's a strong correlation. It is good to actually use this deprivation for areas that are not identified in the data that you have. And obviously we bring that back into open data and kind of and share that out. And actually one thing I have here is like on the side is like we other external data sets that you bring them into the model. And it's true experimentation. Like you get open data and it goes like, what do I do with this? And like part of that sometimes is you don't really know a question. It's like you've got a hammer and you just like everything is a nail. But when you look at the data and you have some hypothesis, you can actually go get it and start exploring, start experimenting, and you come up with these ideas. So like as I say, the high value data sets and the geographic element gets quite valuable and quite strong from the open data perspective, and ensuring that organizations realize that and realize the power of the open data to actually inform policy, to inform the need, and to identify where areas need to be supported is quite good. And this method really supports that. So as I say, look, what has open data done for us? It's provided the data for mathematical models. It helps us create that unbiased objective view of an area. It shows the areas where it needs support. And then it helps guide policy decisions, because a lot of what we've presented, and when we release it, it does get taken up by other departments and goes like, I think one of the recent ones on the disability and the disability strategy for Ireland was then include this, because it definitely helps us target these areas. Seeing correlations and like looking with other independent variables is quite good. It's a struggle, and there can be some noisy data out there, but you do, with good statistical analysis, you will find things. And as I say, you'll find patterns in that data. So like going from open data, just a single tabular piece, to actually some solid information is always quite helpful. So again, if you want to come visit us at pobal.ie or maps.pobal.ie, you will see the deprivation index, and you'll see some of our community profile tools. And you can also be able to come here and download some of the data to look. Another thing to explore, which I didn't speak on, is this comparison tool. So you can see comparison of different waves. It's one of these nice slider tools we have embedded into our platform here. So with that, I hope there probably are some questions, and we can answer away on them. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. This was a great presentation and super interesting to hear all of your insights as well. So yeah, this concludes all of the content for today. As promised, a very interesting Q&A session coming up. So I would like to invite all of the speakers back with their cameras on, and then we can start an open dialogue with each other about some of these topics. Yeah, let's see. We've got quite a lot of questions in. Start with Solana. There's a question from one of the users that says, I work on and contribute to various open data initiatives, but I'm having trouble keeping up with the ever-evolving tools of managing open data. Do you have any advice?
That's a difficult question. I think we're all overwhelmed by a lot of things related to internet and technology. I would advise getting involved with the community. That's the best advice I can give. Have somebody to talk about these things rather than working alone or feeling alone with the challenges. It could be an open knowledge chapter, or it could be something else in the realm of open data or communities working with open street maps. I think that's the best way. Connect with other people, because you will never be up to date with technology because it always changes.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think we all struggle with staying in touch with everything, right? It's so fast-paced nowadays. All right, Johanna, for you, a question. What are the main drivers that could stimulate the collection of data and the openness of data in rural areas by public authorities? For instance, if private companies don't have a priority at this moment or in harnessing data from such areas?
I'm so glad you asked that. Can you hear me? I can't see whether my microphone's turned on yet.
Yes, we hear you.
So I'm so glad. I am very much a fan of that open data has to be user-centric. So it has to be driven by the users. I also very much believe, and I know that this is also something the Open Knowledge Foundation work on, is that we have to do a lot of kind of pre-literacy training for people to understand, for the average person to understand on the street. I know what my social challenges are in my community. I can be part of changing that. So, understanding that what, for instance, civic tech is, what community innovation is, even what citizen science is, we're getting that out so that people understand that they have a role in creating things. And so there's a lot of, as I said at the beginning, that happens a lot in cities. We need to make sure it happens in rural areas as well. That has its challenge, so that we have communities that.
I see we briefly lost Johanna, unfortunately. Let's hope she reconnects in a minute, but hopefully she can answer the rest of the question shortly. Then we move on to Patrick. We have a question from someone in the audience. Would you consider adding another indicator about the level of AI skills in the future, since it may become an important factor describing education and employment status?
Indeed, good question, because how deprivation is recognized across kind of changes wave on wave, and there is more data. I think in broadband came in one as a question in the census that we could use. However, in terms of consistency and to be able to compare from time to time, it's like we need to keep it the models. But like what you can do is, like, if you have a consideration, okay, let's consider technology, and I say with that broadband accessibility piece, we create that as a separate kind of miniature model within that, and you can actually create little weighting. So let's say put say 90% of it towards deprivation, that 10% towards the technology aspect, or whichever data you have, and like you can use that then as a model. So it's actually, of these areas that are deprived, let's add on, see, does it scale up or down on the actual, on that. the data of technology. And also, like, again, I'd be straight up, okay, let's do some correlation analysis to see if we can actually see that exists. They can have it independent within the index, because that would be one of the first things you would do, because like health there like was one of the stronger elements to that would correlate strongly with deprivation. I was like, okay, shall we include this in as an part of the index? But then you have kind of becomes a confounder. So it's, if health becomes bad, and like especially at the time when it's sampled, it can then say, oh, this is only bad because of health. And it goes, we try to keep consistent, try to stick with that model, because like a lot of research has gone into this, and it's like we can't be playing around with it too much. And again, like we have this question a lot of times is, okay, look, just add on, create a little subset of a model, and you can then use that.
Really nice insights. Thank you for your input there. Solana, another question for you. How can people have more control over the data that is controlled about them nowadays, considering the increasing demand for big data on all populations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, you know, across all data, all countries, all people. I think in general, I wonder about the data that we don't have, or the data that we forget that we should also get. I'm thinking of data that's held by corporations that perhaps should be owned by the public. It could be around transportation. It could be around economies, economics in different ways. A lot of data that's held by governments and corporations that should be public, to enable more transparency and to correct some of the power imbalances that exist when only some people in society have access to data that is used to make decisions that affect their lives. And so that's part of, I mean, I saw some of the other questions in the chat were also around risks of data related to terrorism, for instance, or related to hacking. How do we assess those risks is an important question, and is like a process of negotiation, I think, between organizations, communities, trusted advisors. You know, it's the kind of thing Open Knowledge also does as a service, is trying to help people figure out, should we make this data open? Should we not? What should be the process? I think the question that we should also be asking is, what is the risk of not publishing this data? So when you think of something like terrorism, that's obviously terrible. I don't want to minimize that kind of risk, but I think a much greater risk that we sort of close our eyes to or have become accustomed to is how data perhaps is used systematically to deprive certain people of services, or discriminate against people in different ways. Like one example I can think of, just like a real life example, just to show, I mean, could be data that shows where forest fires are more likely to happen are obviously great if you want to help improve the situation for people who are at risk. But the same data can also be used by insurance companies to take people's insurance rights away, so that they can't get insurance if they are living in a place where they are at risk of needing it. Another example would be how economic data is used by banks or maybe car companies to not allow people to get loans, you know, to systematically deny people access to bank loans if they happen to live in an area that is poor or has some kind of category on it that, you know, makes people want to discriminate. And there are rules that can be set against this kind of discrimination. So it's not necessarily that you don't make that data available, or that you decide that only certain gatekeepers should have access to that data, but it could be something as simple as, you know, I'm reminded of, you know, there was a rule that was enforced in the US at one point, or that was passed, that was disallowing people to buy ads on Facebook that discriminated on race. So people would buy ads offering jobs or offering housing opportunities, but then filter out people of certain races or of certain demographics or of genders. And these are things that can be legislated against and made unlawful. But in order to know that that discrimination is taking place, you need a lot of data and transparency and data literacy in civil society and in government in order to be able to interrogate that data and those decisions. So, yeah, I think it's the questions that we ask of data and who we ask of them. And I think really having a stronger focus on the more powerful entities in society and encouraging openness of data about them, I think is a good way to start to sort of balance some of these questions and conversations we have around what data should be accessible. But definitely the risks are important, and we need a lot of people at the table deciding. So sometimes it's also about slowing down, working together, and then iterating on it over time. So the type of governance that you set for a data set or for a specific type of data, you also have to be willing to iterate on that over time with new risks or new priorities that come up from a certain population. But that needs to be sort of incorporated in how you think of the data over time, that you keep revising and going back to it and improving how you work with it.
Great. That was really insightful and really cool that you made those applications to real life things that are happening right now. So thank you. Glad to have Johanna and Patrick back following the little technical difficulties. I have some more questions for you as well. So Johanna, for you, in your research, how did you distinguish whether a data set was rural or urban?
Right. Yes, we took population data from countries and areas that defined as by Eurostat, and then for the economics we selected based on what was a primarily rural industry. So food, fisheries, agriculture, and the other one, which is escaping me now, those four were our. So it's a fairly blunt tool, but it's sufficiently clear enough to give guidance on it. And while I'm here, I did see someone asked a question saying, well, isn't some of this affected, for instance, the fact that 94% of the agriculture data sets, isn't that a function of how the data sets are harvested and the metadata presented on data.europa.eu? Yes, it is, but two things about that. First of all, doesn't make the data sets less legitimate. And it doesn't mean that somebody might not want to use, for instance, the data sets from one part of Germany for another. It also doesn't change the difference between tens of data sets and tens of thousands of data sets. We are factorially different here. So while we do think, yes, if anything like this, we are going to be somewhat affected by the methodology, of how the data.europa.eu is set up as a metadata catalog, and also of how the original statistics are created, how, when we're looking at the Open Data Maturity Index, what that actually calculates. Of course, there is some effect and impact. The only one where we thought it was actually made a difference to our findings was when we weren't quite sure whether, when we were looking at open data maturity, whether our results there were being impacted quite simply by how open data maturity is calculated. We didn't, disaggregate all of it.
Clear. Thank you so much. Patrick, then I have one more question for you as well. Have you seen positive improvements to deprivation area scores over time, for example, in response to targeted education interventions based on your work?
So obviously a lot of that is over a long term, and is when you do support an area, you can actually possibly see something in the census, but like we won't see that for like another 5 years or even 10 years. I have seen personally, looking at the data, seen some areas that I know that have had community supports that have increased. But from kind of the statistical analysis and recording all the data, you have to keep track of everything over a long time. And that's not something that I personally have access to. But like I do, like from the ground, I myself kind of have lived in a disadvantaged area, and I've seen support come into these areas, and then the area has pretty much changed. Well, to a degree, and then gentrification has set in. Now, there are other aspects whereby I look at the map and just like compare and using that slider and seeing like there's a disadvantaged area and it's now affluent, and what is it, and try to understand why. And then realizing it was because the entire community, entire estate had been rebuilt. So what was there, maybe social housing, is now gone, and it's now an actual kind of semi-commercial, semi-residential area. I was like, oh, okay. And that's one of the reasons why you'll see kind of such a drastic change. But otherwise, like these other areas kind of slowly improving. Now, there's one thing also to note is that we look at the index from a relative perspective. So in absolute terms, areas do improve, but we're always looking from relative to the rest of the population, are these areas still deprived? But if you actually look at the parameters, you can see education has improved, employment has improved, and kind of the skills and has improved. However, some of these areas that do improve do not improve as quickly as the rest of the country, and therefore they still get left behind. And like, had we looked at that from an absolute perspective, it goes like, oh yeah, these areas are now beyond that threshold and are no longer in a threshold of deprived that they used to be. And they'd be like, no, you're grand, you don't need, you're up beyond the level. But that's from an absolute perspective. But looking from a relative perspective, you then see, yes, you're still deprived and you still need supports. And that our question that's come to us is like, hang on, our area has improved, or we're still classified as advantaged. And goes, yes, but like, you may have improved, but not as fast as everyone else. So we will still support you in whatever, in education, employment programs, and so forth.
Great. And then a quick follow-up question following that answer. Could you give us some examples of the type of support that has been given to the disadvantaged communities as of now?
There's vast, as I say, there's like 40 programs and all, so it's hard for me to give any particular good example. I know for the elderly, like one of the supports in terms of independence, whereby we would support how these penance that go for like these monitoring alarms. There's other programs, like I myself am not involved in actually designing these, so it's kind of hard for me. Like from the childcare perspective, there would be an element whereby of schools or childcare facilities that take a large cohort of disadvantaged people who actually then get extra supports. So like of those who cannot afford childcare would be subsidized through the kind of lowering of kind of fees and introducing a funding program. So like we'd use the index to like, where did the children come from? And then we see, okay, this service is actually classified as disadvantaged because of who the children that come in, and then we support that. So like that'd be a kind of another example, but I guess there's vast, and there's like, in my head, there's so much to take in. As I'm more focused on the identification of the areas and sharing that information out.
Yes, makes sense. But thank you so much for the insights. All right, due to the interest of time, I think we will start wrapping up. There's a few final notes that I want to share. So thank you again so much to all of you for your great insights and the really fascinating presentations. I think it's a really nice, cohesive, it all works together very well and very relevant in today's society and what's happening, of course. So yeah, just some kind of last things to stay up to date on our other Academy in developments. We have another webinar coming up in 2 weeks' time, and that is for anyone in the academia sector or looking into ethics. We're going to be looking at data-based reasoning, and we have 2 experts coming in to talk all about the implications of honest data and data reproduction. So it's going to be a really interesting webinar. So feel free to register. You can do this through our website, but you will also be receiving an invite in your emails. Do you have more things to discuss about this webinar? We really engage you to the collaboration channel. This is a platform where you can have conversations with other people who joined this webinar to talk more about what we discussed today. And yeah, you can ask any further questions here, and we will put them forth to the speakers for today. So yeah, feel free to engage there as well. We'd love to see your other additions. And finally, as you already saw, there's a survey bar at the top and a QR code. We would really love your opinion and see how we can improve these sessions in the future. We really enjoyed having all of you here today, and yeah, are very keen on hearing your thoughts. So once again, I want to thank the speakers and thank you all for joining today. Have a lovely weekend ahead, and we hope to see you all soon.